I'm going to leave that for now. We've got loads of participants on this one. Thank you so much to everyone for coming along today. We have just gone online, so we haven't had much of a chance to do any kind of preamble or talk about what we're going to talk about. So I'm just going to let this flow quite freely and see what happens. What we did for the last session was that anyone who wanted to add something to the conversation put their little yellow hand up, and we kind of moved the conversation along like that. So I think we'll do that. But what I wanted to do to start off with is talk about why I wanted to do the topic of sacrifice. And what I would like to do is host these sessions where they're like open forums to discuss a topic, and you've got lots of great heads all together that you can ask questions to directly as well. So last week, I think we did the egregore, which was really interesting. And each session will lead on from the last one as well. So in egregore, we talked about the nature of these kind of thought form entities that start to control individuals or populations or direct movements or kind of emanations of cult thinking, perhaps you might say, or cults or any kind of cultural phenomenon. And this week I thought, drawing from a lot of the stuff that came up in the egregore session, we'll talk about sacrifice, because very often the egregore, as we discussed, demands sacrifice. It requires feeding, it requires energy, it requires our attention. And one thing I'm thinking about a lot with the sort of current headlines and the current news and things that are going on in the world is it seems as though there's going to be some sort of sacrifice. And what is it that's going to be sacrificed? So in this session, I wanted to talk about the nature of sacrifice in magical practice, in spiritual practice, and also the nature of sacrifice as a kind of scapegoat and proxy, which is something that has been part of magical practice and rituals for a very long time as well. So we could do a quick kind of moving through the group. And if anyone wants to put their hand up to introduce themselves and talk about their perspective on sacrifice, we could start with that perhaps. So we have a very, very diverse group of people on this in this Zoom call. So I think we should have a pretty interesting conversation. So I know Peter pretty well now. Peter is one of my pals in Istanbul. So I know Peter has very strong and interesting ideas around sacrifice, and especially how that relates to Mithraic practice. So Peter, are you up for starting the ball rolling?
Not really. I was hiding in the back. But I wanted to say one thing. I don't resonate with the idea of sacrifice very much. Mm-hmm. I see it as like the other side of a coin. And for me, the other side of the coin is primary, which is the notion of service. Okay, so this is just one way of framing it. I don't want to insist on it, but I tend to emphasize the notions of service as a mode of alignment with an esoteric current. Okay, and personally, I see that as a larger teleological evolution. And of course, there's countervailing forces at work, which we're seeing these days in a very pronounced form. And that's a very different style of egregore, as you were pointing out. So it's not the direction in which I personally wish to focus. But I have to recognize that it's a kind of overwhelmingly negative force on the countervailing force, let's say. It's counter-initiatory. And it has its own sacrificial forms. So from my perspective, we're dealing with this duality. And I'm not trying to suggest a kind of larger good versus evil duality, but one is definitely evolutionary and one seems to be counter-evolutionary. Let's put it that way. So that's my tuppence to open discussion.
And I know that you write about the nature of what is often called the sacrifice of the bull in the Mithraic system. Could you maybe talk about your perspective of what was actually happening there?
Well, it's such a multi-level, multivalent symbol. I guess at the base level, we're talking about this turning away from the obsession with the self towards an obsession with the larger evolutionary currents in which we're all immersed. So that the bull isn't actually sacrificed in the Mithraic tauroctony. It's stabbed in the shoulder. That's to say, it's weakened in the classical way in which a bullfight proceeds through a weakening of the bull. And therefore, it can just as easily be read as a weakening of primordial instincts to allow our higher forms of consciousness to emerge and to take an ascendant role in your life. And again, that is very much tied to this notion of service, where the lower aspects of the self are sacrificed to an extent, although willingly given up, because you're pursuing a much deeper and larger current.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Peter. Ike.
Howdy. Hello, everybody. Good to be here again. I especially love what Peter is talking about here. I think he was out of everybody that I know here, which I don't know everybody, but I know many of the people here. I think Peter is who I would have chosen to lead the combo as well, because when we've spoken many times, service has come up, and I take that tack as well, coming from the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. You know, a lot of people aren't fully aware because they don't get into the depths, the profundity of the inner order, but it's based on service and self-sacrifice, and really not in this kind of smug, self-important way, but in various ways that are focused through ritual. And the way that I've and of course, right, in your life, your Wake-A-Day living. But the way that I've come to understand it is that well, if we're going to talk about sacrifice, right, I guess this is kind of my niche here, is kind of parsing words neurotically, like I do, like, you know, alphabetizing my bookshelves and things of this nature. But we should talk about the different kinds of sacrifice. We should clarify terms there to kind of get to the heart of what's at stake. For me, it's sacrifice very much is based on a duality, as Peter said, particularly the duality of free will and determinism. We sacrifice things all of the time. I sacrifice time for money, money for leisure. That old saying, you cannot have your cake and eat it too. And even though this might not be sacrifice in its most grandiose aspects, it certainly applies when we're thinking about egregores. For me, it comes down to choosing what and how you sacrifice. And there are various types of sacrifice, right? We have material sacrifices that the ancient Hellenistic and Greco-Roman theurgists, even basic cultic practices, they would sacrifice stones, they would sacrifice food, they would sacrifice all sorts of things. They would sacrifice animals. Even then, when you look at somebody like, again, to bring them up, Iamblichus, or let's say Proclus, some of the later Neoplatonic or late Platonic philosophers that were theurgically oriented, they were not necessarily concerned with placating anything. They were concerned with, as Iamblichus and Proclus essentially distill it, sacrifice is not for the gods. Sacrifice is for us. It's for us in order that we become accustomed to seeing the divine in everything around us. So, you know, you can sacrifice also as I kind of mentioned, you can sacrifice your consciousness. In ancient theurgic or hermetic terms, this would have been a sort of noetic contemplation, offering that up to higher forces, deities, spiritual entities, but also in things like just your time and attention. We don't realize it. You know, everything out here is clamoring for your time and attention, and some of it is worthy, and some of it is absolutely not. But I guess in creating this stratification of sacrifices, you know, I open it up to the rest of the panel to discuss, you know, what in particular, what aspects of sacrifice they focus on, or they're more concerned with, or how do they relate to each other. But I will definitely say, just to bring it full circle, that keystone of free will and conscious selection of what you're going to sacrifice is tied deeply into what Peter said. Sacrifice willingly given, and it can happen on a very, very mundane level. It can happen on a very, very rarefied and spiritual level.
Thank you, Ike. Siri?
Yeah, hi everyone. So coming at this from a more kind of conceptual level, but also from a perspective of historical developments, I really like what both Peter and Ike said, and I agree with that. There is a duality to sacrifice. Catherine Bell, History of Religion, she wrote a book on rituals, and she talks about sacrifice as an idea where it's not the same as giving up an offering. In the sacrifice, usually the thing sacrificed is somehow destroyed. So Peter touches on this, right? So the question is it your lower self that's being sacrificed for higher purpose, or, you know, and is it a willing sacrifice or not? And if looking at this from like a historical perspective, like developmental perspective, I really like Baudrillard's 4 Faces of the Image that he writes about in his book on simulacra and simulation. I think that's very important to think about. So in a culture, for example, where kind of in the ancient mystery cults, the reflection of an image is a reflection of profound reality. It's a pure presence, right? It's actually there. The thing, it's not a symbol of something. It is the thing it symbolizes. It has a presence to it. And I think sacrifice ritually enacted in that kind of environment and that kind of framework of thinking is quite different from what you see in the later developments. So the second kind of definition that he has for it is that it kind of masks something, right? So the masking of mysterious reality or mysterious presence kind of increases as we go through the levels of history. Currently, we are very much in a situation where everything in society is mimicry. You know, it's not. We don't live in this perception. I mean, some of the people here probably do, because you do ritual and you're esotericists, right? But in kind of secular society, we are operating in this kind of perspective of simulacra, right, or simulacrum, which means that the sacrifices no longer happen in these kinds of ritual or elevated contexts, but they happen through, let's say, unwilling sacrifice of human beings to corporations, for example, that sort of thing. So, yeah, I think it's important to kind of distinguish that. So, the way that the ancients might have understood this is really not quite what's happening in our own culture to a large extent, right? I also want to point to, like, there's an interesting book by Vevle called The Ruins of Empires, which came out in 1792, right around the time of the French Revolution. And he talks about this, which is kind of touching on Peter's earlier point of how this operates, right? That the ancient mysteries then, right, are turned into moral systems and transformed, and you end up with a kind of notion of sacrificial rites that are warped and kind of, you know, turned into their exact opposite. It's not a self-sacrifice of service anymore. It's an enforced sacrifice of giving up your time and yourself to working for somebody who doesn't care about you, or you know, who doesn't give you any a proper return for your services, you know. So I think it's interesting to look at that development.
Thank you, Siri. Yeah, I think a lot of sacrifices have become a bit like a lot of religions, have become more kind of symbolic and lost the essential nature, because we're just paying lip service to the idea of sacrifice rather than engaging in that act of service for something. Miles, may I come to you now and ask you, because I know, Miles, you go on a lot of pilgrimages and you have a quite different tradition in relationship to Tibetan Buddhism and things like this. So how does sacrifice fit in to your idea of pilgrimage? Like, do you consider it to be an act of service, or is it a sacrifice of time and energy? Because obviously making a pilgrimage is a beautiful thing as well.
Thanks, Sarah. And so nice to be with you all. So interesting for me to hear all the perspectives. I love how you've already laid it out so beautifully with the different levels. Just my mind works so in a weird way. I was thinking about a story. I don't know if it'll fit here, but I travel on pilgrimage. I basically curate pilgrimages for a Tibetan master, Geshe Tenzin Zopa. We were in Japan 2 years ago. From a Buddhist perspective, the pilgrimage is an act of doing two things, basically. One is called purification, and the other is accumulation of merit. I'm sure in the Western tradition there's some sort of equivalent to it, but essentially there's some shedding that needs to happen, which is done on a voluntary basis. Like one takes a pilgrim's mindset to volunteer to let go of something. And on the most rudimentary level, of course, it's time and money and time away from family. But then really the purification has to do with karma, the accumulation of all kinds of negative tendencies and imprints on the mind stream. And so the idea of going on a sacred journey is not just necessarily to make it to the final destination, but along the way, how one engages in just the arisings of consequences and impasses and flight delays. And I mean, imagine if you were right now in Dubai or somewhere, and the difference between a tourist stranded in Dubai and a pilgrim stranded in Dubai is quite different. That condition or circumstance for the well-trained would be a ripe initiatory opportunity for shedding of selfishness or greed or pride or jealousy or whatever the rub might be. And of course, while things are being shed, then there's also the opportunities along the way, not just at the destination of the power places, but along the way with other pilgrims, with other like-minded people to cultivate virtues. So if anyone's traveled on the Camino, for example, I mean, the good cheer that is spread liberally across the road, is really, archetypally exactly where our civilization should be heading. People of different orientations, people of different temperaments, people of their own unique predilections still share something in common, which is gratitude and humility and respect. And so there's that kind of lubrication along the road. To go back to Geshe Tenzin Zopa, there was a moment we were in Koyasan, which is the tantric enclave of Japan. And we had several nuns with us, in addition to just a cohort of mostly Western pilgrims. And then one of our nuns, had a knee issue. And so we had asked for a chair in this shukubo, a guest house, a temple guest house. Geshe Tenzin Zopa was with us. I was the cure organizer. So I was, busying myself trying to, find solutions for people the whole time. It's just, so she needed a chair, and it seemed like such a modest request. She couldn't sit on the floor to eat her meal. So I was looking for a chair. We asked for a chair, and there was probably one of the managers was quite blunt and said no, which caught everybody off guard. And so right there in that moment, what arises in your mind stream is the kind of thing, if it's a negative reaction, then it's the kind of thing that alerts to your consciousness, this is something to be purified. It could be, concern, it could be anger, it could be outrage, it could be indignation or whatever it is, or just, some sort of resentment or whatever, not understanding the culture, not understanding, Anyway, the nun and I looked at each other. We were like, what's going on here? But Geshe Tenzin Zopa turned it into a wonderful teaching moment. He's, in the middle of it, he basically stopped everybody and said, listen, he's right. There's something so valuable from the no when we need something for us to look at. We need to hear that. We need to hear more no's, especially in our culture, which is instant gratification and entitlement and all of this. So it's where the rubber meets the road. That's where Geshe Tenzin Zopa was saying, no, that's where this is our teacher. He was basically saying, this is a tradition in Tibet called Lojong, the mind transformation. It's taking the adversity and turning it on its own head and showing you, in the mirror where the work can be applied. But then he did this other remarkable thing, and I don't hope I'm not taking too much time and boring you, but it'll always stay with me. He said, it was moving actually. He said, don't you think I want to be comfortable too? Don't you think I want to be stress-free and have a fun life? Don't you think I want to live in a comfortable high bed? I've been with him 20 years. He never said this either. He said, don't you think I want a family and kids? So I want all of that. But none of that is conducive to my higher aspiration. And this is what is regarded in our tradition as the great bodhisattva resolve, the altruist, the awakened altruist who seeks to benefit others using their embodiment and whatever challenges arise. And so what he said at the very end was, I'm up to my neck in responsibility. He grabbed his throat like that. And he said, but I'm only looking for more. I'm only looking for more. I don't know where that lands for people or if they're even in the right track here. But, when you asked me to come on, the first thought I thought of about sacrifice was some image of like a goat on an altar in Greece or something. I don't know why that, but here it is. Here's the image that, maybe you can speak to it, any of you. What the hell am I talking about? How did I make this departure? What relevance does this story have?
Oh, that's great. Very relevant, I think. Anyone else want to come in after Miles? Lovely story. Thank you, Miles.
I'd be happy to jump in, Sarah. Yeah, I'm kind of approaching this from a place of curiosity and mystery, since sacrifice and offerings is this universal that shows up across cultures. Why does it show up in so many different places? What is the origins of the sacrificial impulse? So that's curious for me as well, and maybe someone else could touch on that. But there are a number of counterpoints and examples in history that kind of imply the need for the self-sacrifice and kind of the virtuous behavior at the earliest stage. One early example of this is the book of Isaiah, right, where God is condemning the Israelites for having so much blood on their hands, but for not having a corresponding virtue expressed in their behavior. And then you get, we could jump to Apollonius of Tyana, who's looking at these characters approach the temple and they're throwing gold and they're throwing animals and, they're wealthy and they're throwing all these things at the altar, and they're thinking that, this is clearly a projection of their ego in the sacrifice. They're not really sacrificing anything that's actually has that emotional kind of connection to them. And he corrects this, and he encourages this verbal or sacrifice of intelligence and gratitude, and it brings it back to this internal kind of behavioral approach, which is also implied in the sort of book of Isaiah, that you need that corresponding behavior, or else these rituals are just these kind of meaningless rituals without any correspondence. And in across the Corpus Hermeticum, in a few places, when they talk about sacrifice, it is explicitly in this kind of verbal in the manner of how you pray, and what you're giving gratitude for, and you're sacrificing the kind of 12 avenging daimons, which are these sinful behaviors. So those are some early examples of sacrifice, connected with self-transformation. And that strikes me as very applicable to our modern predicament, especially with our instant gratification society and so on. We should get clear about, what we are sacrificing and why. And I think in everyone's life, you're going to reach the kind of the dark night of the soul moment where you get this choice. And the choice is, do I want to sacrifice these darker aspects and these greedier aspects of my ego that they make me feel good, and they provide this kind of short-term, rushes of dopamine and so forth? Do I want to sacrifice those things for this higher calling and this higher purpose? And right there is the kind of conversation that I think is very applicable to our modern predicament. Yeah.
Collin, thank you very much. That really reminds me of, like Peter mentioned, sacrifice as being this kind of purification process, and that it isn't something necessarily that you are unwilling to give up. It's an act of service. And it makes me think about the kind of alchemical dimension of sacrifice, this idea of burning away everything that is impure to get to the essence, to get to the spirit of something. And I wonder whether very ancient people, because we can't really say how long this idea of sacrifice has been gone on for, but if you look at ritual centers in Anatolia, for example, certainly some sort of practices were occurring there, perhaps something that we could compare to sort of later ideas of sacrifice. But I wonder whether it was something that was noticed in the natural world. I think, we're just at the vernal equinox now, and it does seem as though the world goes through this process of death, sacrifice, destruction, and then rises again in the spring to be this pure new life. So maybe it was something that people saw mirrored in the natural world, that the world goes through this process of offering up in abundance and then being sacrificed, dying, returning to the earth, and then being reborn in the springtime as well. Because, a lot of you have mentioned the mystery cults, and that tends to be the agrarian, the early agrarian rites are generally the things that turn into mystery cults, and then that idea of sacrifice becomes like a regular ritual feature of them.
I'd love to add on to that.
Yeah, Brandon?
So yeah, it kind of nails it with exactly what you're saying, and Collin and everyone else is speaking quite clearly about that and quite wisely. I'd like to add into the idea of sacrifice as kind of stemming from the ideals of to make sacred, right? And so a lot of in our current zeitgeist, we see sacrifice as as Miles talked about at the end, this whole bringing up the goat on a pillar and pyre and sacrificing it to the gods. And I like to try to understand that through somebody who's changed my life, Joseph Campbell, right? And the monomyth and the hero's journey. And I think it's important that we understand that what these symbolic references actually do for our own psychological transformation is that when we're adhering to and accepting the call to adventure, we're actually sacrificing the old self for something new. And then once we go out into that adventure, we are actually, sacrifice is at the very underpinning of everything the individual does along the journey. And so you do have that initial call to adventure sacrifice, but then you also have the great supreme ordeal, as Joseph Campbell called it. And that is once you're in the belly of the beast, you must make the grandest of sacrifices to obtain the holy sepulchre, the philosopher's stone, the holy grail, or whatever that is. And then once you have that, you have to still make more sacrifices, because the hero's journey, the call to adventure, these things are never done. You also then, upon the departure, when you go home, you make that sacrifice one last time. You must sacrifice everything that then you've become to give that Philosopher's Stone or that Holy Grail away to then the village that you once left, which is really important. So I think, especially in a monomyth like Joseph Campbell way, we always forget that the sacrifice is happening throughout the whole thing. And then to bring it to kind of my specialty and my nerddom is that one of the greatest canons of alchemical literature is actually something called Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. And it's one of my favorite anime of all time. And the very underpinning of that show is actually the laws of equivalent exchange, which speak of to obtain something, something of equal value must be lost. And I think that we are doing that all the time, like everyone said before me, is that we're giving away our awareness. We're giving away our impressions. It's actually in everything we see at all times in these black mirrors that we hold right next to us. The thing that we're looking into is that, as Collin put on his Instagram, he's sacrificing his morning to come be here with us, which I thought to be both very quippy and very hilarious. And it's the truth, is that we are at all times giving up a little of ourself. And so it's really interesting how then when I spoke to Mark Stavish for one of my interviews in his great book, The Egregore, he didn't really want to talk about that because it seems that the egregore is what comes up in all things that we do. So upon talking about just living in the world, we are actually always sacrificing to some greater idea. And so upon this journey and this call to adventure, we must understand that we are going to become conscious agents so we can become initiates, or so we can be ones who are actually heroes on the journey, so we understand what we are actually sacrificing, so we can then transmute that and then gain that thing that we can then bring back to the world, because it's not enough just to do it for ourselves. But I think kind of what Miles was talking about is that bodhisattva nature, is that we're trying to, each individual, especially on this panel, as we are all, esotericists or magicians or whatever it is, philosophers, we must understand that the greatest sacrifice is the self for the higher self or the greater self. And then once we do that, we can go back to our family and our small cities and our towns, thus giving whatever that holy grail is to our that we've gained on the journey to the rest of our people. So that's kind of my little take on what is it that we're sacrificing. Well, we can make that decision every time we leave our small little circles and go out in the world, and then we can become that agent of light or beingness, so we can understand that truth can then disclose itself to us, and we can then become change.
Thank you, Brandon. As you were talking there, I'm reminded of the story of Prometheus tricking Zeus and sneaking the kind of bones underneath the glistening layer of fat story. I wonder if anyone wanted to talk about that, because that's kind of like the archetypal sacrifice from mythology, this idea that sacrifice is a theohenia, a sacred meal with the gods. So thinking about sacrifice as this kind of magical act of sharing and binding with the creators of the world, with these divine entities. JD, I wondered if you might like to talk about the kind of astrological, astronomical, magical entanglements between what we do here on Earth, what we can give to the entities of the stars and the planets. Have you got some thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in preparing to have to talk about this or try to talk about this with others, a lot of my initial cluster of thoughts and impressions really came from, my original background is in anthropology, so generally I would look in like a broader way in my understanding at a topic, and then how it might tie into how I've been bound up in different traditions that have elements which could be talked about within the idea of sacrifice. And so, yes, definitely in terms of what we might call like astromagical practices, I think that there is a thing to talk about in there. But to tie it back to something that you were saying earlier about what is it that we may be seeing in the world that we then relate to this. And that led me first to the ideas that that arise from within Vedic traditions, which is the idea that the sun is cooking the world. And, you know, this is an idea that comes from an anthropologist named Malamud, who was studying Vedic ritual and the practice of fire offerings that were made, and where animals, substances, or plant substances are burned in a puja. And some interesting things come up around that, and that, you know, the thing that is really being thought about is this idea of cooking the world, and participating in its cooking is like a way that it's like the right way to bring both like an internal and an external sort of aspect to what's going on. So ultimately within those traditions, the Brahmin who is doing the puja is the actual sacrifice. They are the sacrifice themselves. And it's through substitution based on ideas around what animals or plants may be appropriate to represent the transformation that they are actually eliciting within themselves, that goes on there. And that's, I don't know like how relevant that is, but I think that equally, like, it's hard for me not to think about what might be the case of what we may define as sacrifice within like these contexts that later become, through like different tantric and upadhyasinic traditions, become more about all internalized. So the body is the site of the sacrifice, the breath is the agent of what is sacrificed, and the mind or transformations of the mind or contemplation become like the thing that is ultimately involved in all of that. So there's not there's really the sacrifice of the self, or like aspects of the self that are involved in that. Or you could have within Buddhist tantric stuff, like Miles would be more familiar with, you know, there's wrong perceptions that you're trying to annihilate by sacrificing some version of a misunderstanding of self as existent. And in that way, you know, you're actually visualizing chopping your own body up and offering it in a cup to like the deities or the Buddhas that you work with. So in all of these, you see like how, at least within those, you're all seeing how the self of the person who's offering the sacrifice, some aspect of them is like bound up in the actual process of what is going on. You know, there's not like a separateness from it. And the last two that I would maybe bring in, and then I'll be quiet about it for a little while and then eventually answer your question about the Astromagic part, is that within animist systems, usually this is about relationships. And so if you killing will always maybe has the potential to disrupt spiritual and also social, broader social connections, if we view it as like relational, you know. So in this way, ritual is usually utilized to maintain reciprocity and dynamics within a broader understanding of the group. And so for me, like, I'm trying to move away from certain things that might be more obvious within astral magic, where ultimately you could take examples from the PGM or from the Picatrix, where we have the idea that how we engage in it, be it animal, plant, or mineral, it's usually combined with the timing. So if it is like a solar related thing, there's often like either the sun is in a strong way in an astrological sense, or we're aligning it with an important solar moment like dawn. and the sacrificed animals are birds because they have a quality that relates to the cosmic force. And a lot of times through those, there's either a thought that you're either aligning with like an astral connection, so you're utilizing all of this to do that. If you're making talismans or in soul statues or whatever you might think of it, whatever tradition, it's usually also like a utilizing of the animal's components, which are either released to, I guess, bring forward the cosmic essence, if you will, because there we probably are speaking about an idea of the sacrificing, the burning, or the killing of the animal as a way of releasing that essence. And then it could be to, again, elevate you to the place of the gods, or wherever we want to think about that, or the gods in the world is being reiterated, like Ike mentioned. Or it could be also about trying to bring that into a more material form that is now held or within a talisman or a statue, so it's like a sense of alignment that is going on there. But I think that, this is something that anyone who's engaged in, I'm not a reconstructionist, so I don't like obsess over trying to figure out exactly what was done before so that I can repeat it perfectly as it should be done. But I think that any time I've ever been engaged in the practices that I'm involved with making talismans or with various things that could be thought of as theurgical, a lot of these the messiness of these thoughts sort of sit within my understanding about it, and it's kind of evolving. But the last thing that I kind of wanted to say, and then I will be quiet, that brings it back to what you were saying, is that I think the way that sacrifice inhabits like a contemporary Western imagination is an important thing for us to sit with within a conversation, because we generally think about human sacrifice and we think about blood, and these things have a rich history within Christianity that I think are quite important, and the way that Christianity has a lasting influence within our social and our imagination, social life and imagination. But equally, I think that it sits within that idea, and I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but I think like a lot of people, when they're imagining it, they're imagining like a releasing of some kind of bound up libidinal force that is like we enter some very strange state of primal something when we would kill another human and offer their blood, so in this way, what is released really from that kind of aligns with the idea of something is being released when it's happening. But then why it is happening, what transformation is it meant to elicit, or what relationship is it like recreating, I think is up for a question in the moment, which maybe is more relevant to the focus of why you wanted to bring it up. So anyway, that was enough. I've said too much.
That was great. Thank you very much, JD. Ike, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, that was actually quite relevant, I think, and beautifully put in a lot of instances. And I guess I'll elaborate a little bit based off of what JD was talking about. I speak mostly, not entirely, but mostly in an experiential component or capacity from both Freemasonry, but more in particularly the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And so that's kind of where I'm gonna, that's where I'm gonna be coming from. But there's a mundane sacrifice in this system, or an acknowledgement of mundane sacrifices. And then there is a gesturing toward and eventually a revelation of a greater sacrifice, what we might call a spiritual sacrifice, to use a kind of cliched and generic and hazy term. But An example of mundane sacrifice, not, okay, moving on from sacrificing time, sacrificing money, sacrificing energy. There are sacrifices that need to be made. In other words, we sacrifice the innocence and the leisure of childhood for the changes in anatomy and position within family, within society that puberty brings about, and then eventually into adulthood. That's a sacrifice that has to be made. If you're not willing to make that sacrifice in all of its ways, it's going to be painful for you. Now, that change itself is painful regardless, right? I mean, most of us, I think, here can recall that change and like, like I would want to go back for any amount of money. But there is a prolonged pain that is fighting nature. And so in the Golden Dawn, when you're first initiated, you're called a neophytos, neophyte. That means, obviously, many people here understand this language, newly planted. What is being implied specifically in the Golden Dawn through this is that, like a seed, you have something in you. You have an oak tree, you have a maple tree, but that thing cannot take root and grow until you die. The seed must become something completely different in order to fulfill what it was meant to do. Okay, so I also studied Chinese medicine for years. That's my primary educational background. In Chinese medicine, we'd say that the seed and its dissolving of that outer membrane and the setting of roots and the shooting of the sprout, that it does that because it's qi. Okay, it's not just, qi isn't just this substance. It's a term to reflect nature, what nature does. It does this because it's qi. I would say our qi, or if we want to put it in Proclean terms, our paradigm, our greatest good, the thing that we are constantly trying to get back to and mimic. Some people have a very confused way of doing this, right? They think that they're trying for their greatest good, even when they're doing horrible things. Cheating people, lying, stealing. They think that they're going for their greatest good. But our qi, our greatest good, and at least according to the Platonic philosophy, and I agree with this, would be our eros. Eros. It's not in terms of physical erotic love, but more so the desire that our soul has for reunion. Now, that reunion isn't just you kind of, ascending into the stratosphere and dissolving, becoming one with the cosmos. In a more practical sense, it's grounding in the material reality and recognizing everything around you as divine, and nothing here is more or less important than you. Particularly less. Nothing here is less important, less important than you are. Everything is kind of has that equal amount of divinity in it, but each of us has a different qi, and I would orient strongly that this sacrifice is in order to. It is something that has to happen in order for us to evolve into our greatest good, into our highest eros. And in the Golden Dawn, we say, when you take your obligation, you say, from this day forward, I die to the old life and am reborn to the new. And you vow to expend every possible energy, effort, resource in the pursuit of being elevated and rising by divine aid to union with your higher divine genius, which is the personal daimon. The personal daimon is the higher genius of the Golden Dawn tradition. And we say, in doing so, to become more than human. But in my experience, it's not necessarily to become imbued with angelic or godly powers. It's to become more than just human. So in other words, to put a big bow on this, for me, the experience, at least of where I am in this process, is to be led, to have guidance that is higher than just what you want in that immediate moment, or even you sitting there with pen and pencil trying to draw out this equation and say, well, if I do it this way and do it that way, it'll work and it'll be for the greatest good. And a lot of times, right, as we say, man plans and the gods laugh. So it's this ability to be led and getting in touch with I think, these a sort of higher order of intelligence I think, you know, that's what it looks like for me. That's what it looks like for a Golden Dawn practitioner. It's that making that communication and then widening that stream and allowing yourself to be guided through this life.
Thank you, Ike. Peter and Alkistis, could I bring you in at this point? I'd love to hear your perspective and how you see sacrifice, or if you have responses to anyone so far.
Many interesting things said, and I'll try and feed some of the thoughts I had about what I've been hearing. But my background is, my spiritual path is as a dancer. So dance is my spiritual path, and particularly it is specifically Buto. And there is an image of the great burned sacrifice. So dance as being a great burned offering or sacrifice, and also one of the sort of core positions within Buto is called the ash column walk. Or it's a walk where one removes, it is like an emptying or a removal of the sort of daily consciousness and just an eradication of the self in order to transform. So it's this 0 point, or this empty body, which is the sacrifice itself through dance. And the transformation of the body, of the self, of movement, but on a spiritual level as well, is driven by sacrifice. But this kind of sacrifice, dance and movement as sacrifice, and breath and intention. And so I was, yes, like time, attention, all of these things are sacrifice, but I was thinking about intentionality as well, that when I'm dancing, there's a sort of a breath, a greater breath with the cosmos, in which there is an exchange continually, like a cycling. It's sort of like alchemically charges up the energy so that more change is driven, more transformation can take place. And it's in this sort of reciprocal relationship with what's outside through the breath and through movement. But I also thought that we are also participating, like not every time that we lose our attention or we give our time are we making sacrifice, because so often we're participating as sacrificed, as just giving up attention or giving up time, and not being consciously like doing that, but it just being this lowering of attention and consciousness. Or just to consider the idea of participating in the world as we are, that we are living now, in other people's sacrifices, knowingly or unknowingly, and how one deals with, how one psychologically, but also emotionally, recognizes one's participation in like the whole world of sacrifice, this turning through lives, beings, death. Yeah, I don't know if that made a lot of sense. It really is, within Buto, sacrifice is the thing which drives transformation and drives spiritual transformation. So dance is the thing which allows us to become more than human or other than human. That's really the thing I wanted to, that I had been thinking about this, yeah, rather than the sort of kind of cliched ideas of sacrifice. That's one aspect in which sacrifice is central to what I do. So,
Wonderful. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Thank you everyone who's here and for all giving up your time. It's been lovely to hear your different perspectives. And just talk under a few sort of headings I've been making while I've been sitting here, of blood, fire, and flowers. So my background is in Western tradition, from a thelemically inspired path. So the majority of my work has been engaged with a sacrificial practice based on some of Crowley's ideas about the bloody sacrifice, about the offering of the self to the beloved. So the ideas that I have around sacrifice come out of my own personal work, which is very often an offering work of blood and fluids. This is like the typical Western tantric approach to things. And I was hoping we were going to have judo here as well, because one of the things that's missing in the West is is an offering of animals in sacrifice. Most of the time, as Western practitioners, what we're doing is we're talking about giving ourselves up to the higher self, or sacrificing ourselves as the self to the beloved, rather than sacrificing something to a spirit as part of a transactional relationship. So I just wanted to say that there are a few things to think about with this blood sacrifice, and one of them is very much what we know about, which everyone has two wolves, and which wolf do you feed? And there's always a risk when you're engaged in a practice of sacrifice that you're entering into a pact or an arrangement with spirit. And in doing so, it's quite easy to be pulled out of shape by that and by the demands of the spirits you're working with. So there's also a negotiation with sacrifice. There's a need to both have boundaries and also to push one's boundaries. And it's that difficult process which often goes wrong for Western practitioners, largely because they're working as lone individuals rather than in the temple setting, for example, that Ike has with his Golden Dawn group. That seems to be a rarity rather than the rule. The rule tends to be lone individuals making terrible mistakes. So the path of sacrifice can very often lead to people living disordered, dysfunctional, chaotic lives, and thinking that they're engaged in a process of sacrifice when they're in fact simply engaged in a process of failing disastrously at life. So that's the blood part of it. The second aspect that I wanted to mention was fire. So fire is a very important part of the sacrificial process that I work with. We see this classically with the example of Jack Parsons. When Jack went through the Babylon working, he spent a lot of time passing things through the fire to the goddess. So he was putting things that were important to him into the other world. So he was very much giving up things that he didn't want to give up, which was interesting to me because some of my earliest magical work involved burning objects that I didn't wish to pass through the fire. So there's a need to give up something that is difficult for oneself. And again, with blood offering, I'm pretty hemophobic. So when I make a blood offering, it's not something that I wish to do. It's something that my body rebels against me doing. So in order to do so, I'm extending my control over myself. And again, something we do with books. Very often when we've finished a book, we will pass a copy of the book through the fire into the other world. So we're literally going through that boundary and using fire to pass through into the other world for that. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about was flowers. So I've been reading a lot of D.H. Lawrence at the moment. So everything in my head's a bit D.H. Lawrence-y. So we were up on the moors for the equinox the other day, and there are a lot of very old stone tombs up there, and so we went to make sacrifice for the spring equinox. And the sacrifice that I made for the spring equinox was a single wild violet and an offering of water to the dead to communicate and talk to them about spring coming back to the land, and to spend some time in their world. And this is the other thing with sacrifice, in that I'm very careful about what I take and what I offer, and where it comes from. This is a very remote site, and I found a bank of wild violets, and I took a single one of these tiny flowers as an offering and a sacrifice. And the question is is this my sacrifice to the dead, or is this the violet sacrifice to the dead? Is this the sacrifice that's coming from the land, and what part do I have in passing through this kind of these great kind of rivers of time when I'm talking to the ancient dead and I'm talking to the spirits of the plants that are in the land, and I'm engaging in this. So sacrifice is such a huge subject for all of us, and it's a negotiation, and it's an offering of self, and it's an offering of other, and it's a standing in for something that we're doing when we're engaged in the process. And I hope that's some help to people.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Alkistis. Thank you so much, Peter. And Alkistis, what you mentioned about your dancing, and was it the column of ash that you mentioned?
The ash
and
column.
it really makes me think of this idea of to prepare yourself in a theurgic sense is this idea of an emptying out, making yourself this pure empty vessel so that you can be filled with divine essence, almost like a possession. And that makes me think as well about sacrifice, as I mentioned at the beginning, as this preparation of a scapegoat or a proxy that takes on the unwanted aspects of self. So say, for example, in magical medical practice, you transfer an illness onto a goat and then you slaughter the goat, or you set the goat out to roam free and you just send it off. So wonderful points. Thank you, both of you, so much. Anyone else? I saw, Shaween, that you had your hand up earlier. Are you there, Shaween? Hello.
Hi, Sarah. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to hear everybody's perspective. And the way that I come to the study of what the sacrifice is my background is in engineering and in chemical engineering, and I have done a lot of work related to different processes that consciousness can also be part of, the medium, the flow, and the potentials to go when basically like in the physics that we know, there's always a flow from where the potential is higher to where the potential is lower. So when you bring this into phenomenology of experiences and look into a sacrifice from that sense, the way that I have been studying it, it's actually coming from Mazda Yasna, or basically the tradition of Zarathustra, which is a type of an Indo-Iranian, kind of like after the Indo-Iranian split into the land of Iran and India. So the way that Gathas, which is is related to Zarathustra, defines Zarathustra. It defines Zarathustra as a Zotar, which is a fully officiated priest of his time. And Zaot, or Zaothra, this word, which is an ancient Old Avestan word, it actually means offering. So the priest, or like when, as a fully ordained priest, when they wanted to have this exchange, like this libation or offering, the offering was done to the source of the elements like that contribute to our vital forces and life. So one part of the Zotar was participating in this ceremony called Yasna. And in Yasna, they are having these offerings to fire, to water, to other elements. It's more like elements that contribute to return of the vital forces that we have used as human, and then we have to give an offering to refill these sources that being used. In the offering to fire, so what they do is that the offering to fire in Zoroastrianism is related to blood sacrifice. And what they do is that the priest bring a piece of kind of like new fuel, and then an oil of a fresh sacrifice, and then offer it to fire for the fire force, to continue and perpetually like serve human. And when they want to do the offering to water, actually comes from sacrificing this ancient plant, which actually is known as equivalent of soma, which is homa, that they are actually pressing that, like that's pressing is counted as an act of sacrifice of this plant that carries wisdom. And then they mix it with another plant, and then they put milk on it. And then a part of it is actually being taken, which is is a psychoactive compound, is being taken by the priest, like the fully ordained priest, and the other part is actually being given back to the waters that they call it Aban, for the return of the vital forces to waters. So in that sense, they see sacrifice as an exchange between the human order, more, I think, in a primordial term, which is more like connected to what is like more aligned to the unconscious side of our consciousness. And then it's like an exchange with a higher order for the cosmic, it's basically with the cosmos, for an exchange that actually put everything on order. And if you thermodynamically look into it, like the order is aligned with anything that lowers entropy, and the disorder or chaos to the higher entropy. And I think this is the distinction that actually comes to the duality of Zarathustra, that he has distinction for how to contribute to something that actually brings back order in a cosmological way, and then what actually bring disorderliness or chaos on the other side, which in Zarathustra's concept, I think this is more like a psycho-spiritual framework that's partly related to spirituality too, which order is actually what has to, because order actually has to be ahuric, which is something that actually comes from goodness. And then on the other side, there's divas in Zoroastrianism or even in Hinduism, that there are kind of like the negative gods or the bad gods. So the distinction is actually between the two, because you can sacrifice to any of them, so to the goodness or to the other side. So my work has been mostly on Homa and the ceremony of Homa, but the connection of sacrifice in Homa ceremony, they call it Ab-Zohr, which is this the offering that's related to the waters, and also to Atash-Zohr or Adur-Zohr, which is the offering of animal, which is offered to the fires. So to me, it's more like the sacrifice is an exchange between human order and cosmological order for bringing us more into like what take distance from chaos and into the order.
Thank you, Shoin. That's very similar to the concept in Greece of making a sacrifice to the gods, and that sacrifice is you're sharing a meal with the gods because you eat part of the sacrifice, or the group eat part of the sacrifice, and what remains is burnt, and that smoke travels up to heaven and nourishes the gods. So that's very interesting. Thank you so much. Siri.
Yeah, I really love that idea of this sacrifice being a function of rebalancing and reordering. Several people have touched on this idea of sacrifice being part of first like a kind of an individual experience, but there is something very important about the collective experience of sacrifice and what it does for the collective. Like, so there are some kind of traditions that I think we can look at in relation to that. And I also wanted to take it back to the question that you asked some time ago, Sarah, when you talked about, like, you can feel that something is going to be sacrificed and you wonder what it's going to be, right? Something is definitely changing in the world around us. Some rebalancing is happening. I mean, you can really definitely see that if you don't only have to open the news to understand that something is going to happen. Something is being sacrificed, and something is kind of like on the offering table in order to rebalance. And what that's going to be, I'm not entirely sure, but the shift is definitely there. And I also think that I just want to ask the question to the group, like, how do you guys see this move from the individual experience of ritual practice and sacrifice within your own sphere, and and this more kind of collective, what's happening in humanity, what's happening in like your country, the place where you're at, like, or in the larger kind of global community, in terms of how this functions, not necessarily through our participation, but just as a force of of the cosmos, right? It demands its own sacrifices. Like when things go out of whack, it will claim something. The same as a pack of gazelles will hunt a zebra, and the minute the zebra is felled and eaten, all the other zebras stop running, because now that the sacrifice has been made, and they can come back to order. And so I wonder if anyone has any thought about this duality of the individual versus the collective.
Thank you so much, Siri. That, I think what Shoin and Siri touched upon there, this idea of the sacrifice as being something about establishing an order and a communication between the divine and the earthly realms, is super interesting, and makes me think also of the principle of Ma'at in ancient Egypt, and how the heart is offered up. And if the heart isn't light and balanced, the person will be eaten by Amit, this kind of chaotic hybrid force. And I think that that's what so much magic is about working out the language of nature, the pattern of nature, so that you can understand the order and read it. So I find that a really interesting idea. Nick? You're muted, Nick.
Sorry, I thought you were in control of that. My bad. I really didn't have an answer to that question. I didn't want to raise my hand to say something else, so I feel bad. I mean, I could give my opinion, but there was something else I even wanted to kind of bring up, because I do think maybe it's something that we've danced around, or maybe in my head, that's what I'm doing. But we're talking about sacrifice, and I think there's many levels to that. Like even like Ike and other people were saying, with giving up certain things, time, money, bad habits, certain behaviors, frames of ways of thinking. But we kind of mentioned something about a great sacrifice, or the ultimate sacrifice, and not to try to take it in a dark area or to try to sound edgy, but due to my own experiences and things that I've looked into myself and research. I do wonder, and I wanted to ask other people's opinion, if part of sometimes sacrifice literally would be the blood and flesh of your own body. Like if you separating your soul from your body, the ultimate sacrifice. Because I am leaving everything else that I'm in love with and attached to in this world gone. That's, I just wonder sometimes if that is something that is actually maybe possibly directed to or pointed at in the esoteric or the occult, is actually like, we're talking about, astral stuff before. OBEs, you look at shamanism, they're pushing themselves to the edge of death. NDEs, some people's stories with NDEs can sound very close to people's magical experiences. So is there, is the death and the rebirth actually literal? Is that the ultimate sacrifice that some people may make to have an experience other people's don't? I was just wondering if kind of the other people.
That's really good. Pascal, maybe this is a good place to bring you into the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's just been so fascinating listening to everybody, because I had an original intention of going off on one about kind of like I did at the end there with the egregore one, about my most recent fixation on ufology and stuff, which definitely has its place here, but I don't want to derail things. But maybe near the end, if we get into weirder territory, then maybe. So I guess one thing I've been thinking before, and touched on especially by showing what he said, which I absolutely loved, and then what Nick kind of mentioned with the near death thing. I don't know exactly how to pass it, but yeah, I mean, so going back to like the etymology of sacrifice, is to make sacred, and this idea of sacrifice of giving something up that is most valuable to the beyond, or something beyond just yourself, your own ego, and thereby making it sacred. And obviously we've spoken a great deal about self-sacrifice how that can lead to service and even, you know, bodhisattvahood. And with that, like around that concept of self-sacrifice and the death of yourself and ego death, I mean, obviously that's something which will be inherent to different types of these kind of esoteric practices, which we've been talking about, but especially like an extremist, like a psychedelic experience. And obviously there may that in and of itself may have a part to play in these magical practices, ancient Greek or other mystery cults, etc., or shamanic kind of austerities, you know, where that can happen in very dramatic ways, or the near-death experience, as Nick brought up, which is more of a kind of explicit death, yet near death. So in terms of how that then links to the making of it sacred, I mean, you know, your very sense of your own extantness in this reality is being threatened, or you're willing for it to be dissolved, which is that then I think allowing for just on a kind of neural level, if we were to mediate it that way, and not any reductionist way, but there is a dissolution of like the self model and your world model, and through that there can be, you know, one can encounter the kind of ground of reality, kind of the noetic revelatory experience, and there, or just this ultimate connection to the universal, or a reappraising of it as ultimately sacred. So it's a sacralization process where you know, one of the original attributes of the mystical experience, you know, is considered this touching of something which is holy, but ultimately you're just you're rediscovering yourself and the world as something intrinsically holy. And again, riffing on the kind of neuroscience thing, which Shireen was saying, but not specifically in terms of neuroscience, but about, he was talking about from a more engineering perspective, but it reminded, and of course disorder and order, as he was talking about, but it reminded me of a systems theory approach, which was actually applied by somebody looking into near-death experiences, and this idea that in near-death experiences, how the central nervous system can be kind of reconfigured, that there's a kind of a release process happening. So he was more referring to engineering and systems theory. So there's a release of consciousness, but he was relating that parapsychologically to like psi, this like principle psi, which can be this inexplicable kind of mediator of precognition or telepathy, whatever it is, or being able to go to some other space, so yeah, I mean, in that sense, it's not just this kind of ritual sacrifices may not necessarily just be thought of as like a symbolic thing, but quite a literally magical thing. But the neuroscientific aspect of that, the way that I would see it, as opposed to his kind of talking about some redistribution of psi per se, linking to what Shireen was saying, is that in like psychedelic neuroscience, for instance, which will be very mapping onto similar processes where there are these self networks, like the default mode network, for instance, or other higher order networks that are being dismantled, you have this release of so-called free energy, and so that's energy which isn't bound up to do something like life conducive. It's being liberated, because of course in this peak psychedelic state, you know, you're not imminently here, your brain isn't wired any longer in order to do whatever it needs to be doing. It's being sacrificed for this kind of higher function, and in the release of that free energy you have entropy. You know, your brain is in this much more chaotic state, and you have this higher entropy state, chaos in the system, which again can kind of sort of linked to kind of chaos magic kind of concept. And so obviously what Sean was saying about disorder and order. So in this whole process, you're having greater disorder in the central nervous system, but then ultimately that does act as a recalibrating event, because you then ultimately have greater order both in your psyche and how that then reflects in your world at large as you're interfacing with it afterward. And I think lastly, I'll just say that the thing that Shaheen said about the good and bad, I thought was super interesting about the Devas as being like this kind of image of a negative god to whom you may sacrifice something. So with sacrifice, you can do it either for the good or for ill, in a way, but it doesn't need to be as kind of literal or explicit as that. But there's a whole set and setting thing with psychedelia, for instance, that there will be it may implicitly end up as being something good or bad in a way, in the terms of how the sacrifice, how the ego sacrifice, how the flow of consciousness, as it were, will be redistributed for better or worse for you or for others.
Thank you, Pascal. That makes me think a lot about theurgy and this idea of, I guess, making a kind of sacrifice of the body, like you say, and as Alkistis touched upon with Bhutto, this idea of making yourself a vessel or expelling ordinary consciousness so that you're in a state to receive things.
Could I add just a little bit after you're done? I'm sorry. I just want to.
Yeah, sure. So that was great. Nick, sorry, go on. What do you want?
Him mentioning the nervous system, me even looking at that is even another reason why I even asked my prior question, because I've even been studying the way the nervous system acts on the herbs that we use and sacred architecture. A lot of them will start to change your vagus nerve, your sympathetic, your lymphatic, to where it will start to sometimes focus you. Like I think he was kind of getting you in a state of mind. But a lot of them also all start to slow your system down. And it's just, to me, it seems a little bit coincidental that there's things being used that is literally starting to slow your system down. And I don't think a lot of people realize it. Like the reverberation and a lot of sacred architecture that I'm recently covering and putting out soon. The way the STI, the decay time, all these things, when you'll make a tone and it'll last 11 seconds. And between that and everything else you're saying, the architecture now, it's like starting to actually affect your nervous system. And it'll start to put you in certain states. And it's just very weird to me that it seems like a lot of these things do aid with focus and slowing your system down. So even what he said with that is just, I wanted to bring up another reason why I brought up such maybe a wild idea is because of me looking at that stuff as well.
Thank you, Nick. It also makes me think, what about if those chaotic states you're talking about are just part of a higher cosmic order that we can't recognize the pattern of? So for a moment, you're in that kind of cosmic wavelength, and that has the ability to recalibrate you as an individual. Because I guess the process of being born and developing an ego in the first place is a calibrating process. We're coming from the great cosmic everything. We're coming from the all. We have to calibrate to our place on earth and our body and our other important relationships so that we identify ourselves. But in those moments where we're outside of self, we are perhaps returning to that kind of great all or that great chaos. And then when we return to self, we have this sort of renewed thing. I'm reminded of, I think I might have mentioned it in the last session, my friend Maria Maragou telling me about someone who went into the Telesterion, who was one of the Mysti and took part in the Mysteries of Ephesus, and how that idea of meeting the gods is a very real thing and seems to involve some sort of out-of-body experience, some sort of NDE where you are obliterated as an individual and you become one with the goddess, with these divine essences. And it was talked about that he was blind when he went into the Telesterion, and you talked about that recalibration, that sort of chaos to organization, that when he came out, he could see. And who knows whether that's true, whether it really happened, whether it was a story, but the concept of that, I think, fits in with this idea of going into, and Nick mentioned certain plants and the things that we eat or the things that we drink affecting our consciousness. And I think maybe you are what you eat, you are what you drink. If you take certain drugs, then the spirit, the essence of these substances are affecting your psychology, because we're less autonomous than we think we are, really. We're like colonies of bacteria. There are so many things that affect our consciousness. We could have Toxoplasma gondii, for example, which I think I've probably just got by spending so much time in Istanbul, because now I love cats. And all these things that affect our consciousness and our idea of our personality. Nick, is that are you satisfied?
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't something I expected too many people to jump on anyway. But
Shaween?
Yeah, I just wanted to refer back to Nick's question about the sacrifice of your body for something. It's actually a very interesting case study that is happening at the moment. I'm from Iran, and this kind of like war between the United States and Israel and Iran, and the mentality of Shia with martyrdom. The fact that they basically this Islamic Iranian government, they know that militarily they are not gonna kind of like be beaten or be defeated. They are not going to win the war and not be defeated. But at the same time, they haven't been surrendered. So the fact that they know that every one of them would be killed at the end of this, like what has happened, from February 28th, with the supreme leader that was actually being attacked and died, and the narrative that's being circulated as the myth between the Shia mentality that these are martyrs, that these are sacrifices for, again, a change of order that's going to happen. And I think in the Shia mentality, what's happening is that they say that like the chaos gets to a point and there should be so many martyrdoms and, sacrifice, like human sacrifice for the higher goal, that the Messiah come, or the Mahdi Ma'ud comes to get this order back to order. And I think that like working with psychedelics, my understanding is that this idea of sacrificing the body doesn't necessarily need to happen. Like you don't need to destroy your biology to from a cosmological point of view to really induce that exchange with the higher cosmic order. I think that the ego death, or anything that, I think from my experience, anything that contributes to a way of getting into a higher state while we can keep the intention of having the connection to that higher state. I think that's the phenomenology of psychedelic or onirogenic experiences, that as long as you can get to that level of exchange between consciousness and unconscious, which is kind of like the work of magic as well. And then you can keep that connection to the higher consciousness that you're processing with intention and in the moment. So this is kind of like any practice of non-duality, that you can get to that level of sacrifice through intention and make that exchange happen, with the higher order. So I think my understanding is that what actually contributes to an exchange, in return for the order in the cosmos to happen, is our attention. When we can amplify it, to higher order, that's what's happening again with the psychedelic or energenic experiences. But at the end of the day, that's the intention and attention that you're putting, as an exchange with the higher order, that comes through, let's say what's called sacrifice of the ego or sacrifice of the body.
Thank you, Shoin. Really good points, really interesting. And I just wanted to triangulate, because I can see Brandon's got his hand up there, with Brandon and Alkistis, because Alkistis mentioned and Brandon mentioned this idea of attention and this idea of intentionality. And Alkistis mentioned about how a big part of it is intentionally giving your attention to something, rather than Brandon mentioned you're just pouring your attention into this black mirror and you're not intentionally or consciously entering into a covenant with the divine by doing that. But when you're intentionally giving your attention, it does feel like a completely different thing, because, one thing I really noticed working in schools is I was talking to a friend earlier about how, we're probably the last generation that grew up without the internet, without these black mirrors at our disposal. And I developed in that culture of never having anything like that, of being in the world without these tools for navigation, without these tools for constant communication. And now there are all these kind of studies showing that children feel terror when they're split from their phones. It's almost like having a daemon cut away from them. They're actually scared to be in the world without this tool for communication that, and we know that people that run these companies don't let their kids go on them. So I wondered if Brandon and Alkistis, we could talk about that a little bit.
Just immediately to respond to that, it's almost like if you don't intentionally give your attention to this like sacrificial process, let's say, we're also entering into a kind of transhumanism, because then the child is accidentally becoming the transhuman that is like already synced up with technology, and even if it's not inside their body yet, it will be soon. They're still so symbiotically connected with the smartphone or whatever, the computer, the tablet. And so these transformations are happening anyway without any sort of conscious, meaningful engagement with it, this reciprocity with the cosmos, with the living beings of the cosmos, with the higher spirits, with the like technology. This is smartphones, things just completely flatten and reduce your humanity. It's like something I see that like what's happening is that we are becoming something else, but that we're not necessarily, many of us, in control or even trying to consciously become something else. Maybe as like esotericists or magicians of various types, we are more implicated in that process. But when I see ordinary people just being changed by their engagement with technology into like the next iteration, and like getting stupider, getting less able to hold a thought or less vocabulary, everything diminishes because we become so dependent on it. I think that's kind of one of the things I was thinking about in terms of becoming part of a greater sacrifice that we're not actually intentionally participating in, but we are, being sacrificed for the next, like the tech bros want us to become the next thing.
I was listening to something yesterday online, a big podcast. It was really good. I think Robert Forte shared it, and it was about how it's actually written into the plans for a lot of these platforms that social media actually does start to change our biology, our physical form, and not even our, mental capabilities, but it certainly is having an impact there, where you think about children now are being are being taught how to do coding and stuff in school, rather than learn about the humanities, learn about culture, learn about beauty, learn about how to have good relationships. Like, I think that it's really important to look at what children are being taught in school, because that's where the agenda is first sort of sewn into what kind of people the powers that be want to see in the world, which are just empty consumers who can be easily controlled and manipulated with the amazing skills that advertising and politics and all this kind of have at their disposal these days.
Yeah, I just wanted to add as well that it's this false light as well, because it's literally disrupting our circadian rhythms and our connection with the wider cosmos. So our pineal gland is all the time like in concert with the entire, cosmos, and not just sunlight, but all the light. And it's telling us and giving our body signals about how to respond and how to be in the world. And this is just automatic, unconscious. This is what the body does. But as soon as you're like bringing this artificial light and all this hyperstimulation into like your face, it is completely disrupting our relationship with the world, with the cosmos, with all beings. And I think that's where I see the danger of this sort of like unwittingly being sacrificed for other people's purposes and darker agendas. And so we have to sort of consciously sort of step back from this to not participate in that. And again, I just don't know how you stop other people, just
really
plunging into it. You can't, but you have to be like that point of calm.
Well, I think I'm so glad you brought that up, because I wrote a book about the history and culture of dreaming, and I think the first thing to be sacrificed is dreams, because circadian rhythms are so disrupted by this false light, and dreams are like self-illuminated landscapes. So I find in my own work and in talking to other people about dreams that dreams are diminishing, and that has been an actual evolution of the human being, that dreams have diminished as a result of our dependence upon technology. And it's taken years to see how this has happened, but our attachment to our phones and our attachment to this fake life and this inability to enter into the circadian cycles that we are naturally wired to is already shows that this plan is working. Thanks about this, Brandon.
Yeah, nice. You guys hit on so many key things there. And I think it's so important that we all understand this, where we're coming from, because we can be moments of light for a world that is fallen, right? We are in Malkuth, we are in the kingdom, which means we connect ourselves to the kleptotic world, the husks. And to get it to more to the dystopian science fiction terminology, we are laden amongst non-playable characters. And so it's like, while we're walking in the world, there are NPCs everywhere, which goes to the term that Alkistis was talking about with the transhumanist agenda that we're completely laden in ourselves upon with the elite parasitic techno oligarchs that are, I like to deem, being the dark sorcerers who we are kind of up against in this cosmic Manichaean kind of drama that is unfolding at all times. And so kind of what you're saying, Sarah, is, in your work, as well as how important dreams are. And why that is because of that is what connects us to the higher realms. We must cross the 30-second path from Malkuth into Yesod, into the moon, into the phantasmagoric imaginal realms. And I think what's so important is that the intentional mind, our intentionalities it's the phenomenological experience that we're trying to bring back instead of being separated. So what happened was, in the Enlightenment period with Cartesianism, is that they separated body and mind. And as fantastic as that was, because we have the whole technological revolution that we're in, what it also did was it then also separated everything that was the embodied experience. And so what I think is really important is that then what has happened is that instead of sacrificing the lower desires, kind of like what Peter talks about in his work, is that we must sacrifice, or maybe just nick the shoulder of the bull instead of completely sacrificing the bull. But we must have an understanding that we sit upon the lower desires because we need those to run the robot that goes upon and works and feeds and has a family and does these things. But through the great work, we are ascending or transcending the normal profane world to the higher sacred world, going back to what sacrifice seems to mean with the sacrificium of the Latin terminology. And so it's like the phones and the cosmic drama that's unfolding in the world, this can be seen as the grand sacrifice of all of our intention and awareness and everything that's going on. And it could also be seen, because I think what's so important is what I learned from Peter is that what we're trying to do is the dark sorcerers are trying to stick us within the grand dualism, which is then what we're trying to merge back together with the embodied phenomenological experience. So we're not being taken over by dark sorcerers. And so we can actually have a spirit and a soul instead of being a transhumanist NPC type of character. And what is it that does that? Well, I really like it when Alkistis talks about her Buto, right? It's that grand cosmic fire dance, that embodied experience where in my own practice, I like Kung Fu, right? So I'm a martial artist. And so I've had to sacrifice a lot and bring to the fire all of my lower drives, lower desires, and the part of me that can't just do a horse stance for 20 minutes. And so it's like, what does that mean? Well, I must root myself into the earth while, like in my Tai Chi practice, lift my Bai Hua, lift my higher mind into the heavens. Thus, in the Taoist terminology, I become the center of the heaven and the earth. And I think with these types of conversations, and with everyone doing their grand work and trying to connect us to the dream realm, we can bring people from the unintentional, unaware, take away the phones, because you're completely right. And what I think we forget is that the blue light is telling us at all times that it's noon out. Not only is it doing that, it brings us to the idea that MK Ultra is real, as in is real, right? As the idea is that what's going on is they use the studies about Las Vegas, where in Las Vegas they use blue light everywhere, because what it does is it sticks people into their lymphatic system and drives high levels of cortisol, thus giving you dopamine and serotonin dumps. And as that's happening, you are easier to control. And if you are easier to control, you then don't have a spirit or soul in your body guiding you to the highest realms, but bringing you into the lowest. Thus, you become like Odysseus entering into the lotus eaters. You become somebody who is just trying to get that continual dopamine fix instead of doing the mystical practices of yoga and magic, which I think you kind of need both to be able to be your hero on the journey, so you can not become a sacrifice for the great wars. As we learned from Orwell, war is peace. The wars will continue to go as long as everyone is not doing their own great work. And so I could continue to talk about that, but that's just one of those things that's really fascinating, is that in this transhumanist world which we're moving into, it's not going away. And so it's one of those things where we have to learn the lingo and the modern myths of our age so we can talk to everybody around us as we integrate the ancient worldviews of magic, myth, and meaning, and try to become re-embodied figures where we're not being controlled by the blue light and our lower drives. And so that's kind of how I think, bring the intentional experience back into the conscious world.
Great. That was great, Brandon. Thank you. That I just mentioned the interview that I saw yesterday that was about this idea of the tech bros including this in their plan, that they're actually changing our biology so we are more easy to control. It was by a guy called James Corbett, and he ended it on a very positive note, I thought, which was, I definitely recommend watching it. I can share the link with anyone who's interested. But he just talks about what they want is your humanity. And if you don't give it to them, they have no power. So the most important thing we can do is retain our humanity. And one thing I noticed, because I spent a lot of time in Istanbul, I've lived part-time in Greece, and in Istanbul in particular, but everywhere, I think I'm noticing people being nicer to each other, because like you say, the veil is falling. We are seeing that it's psyop nested within psyop, nested within psyop. and actually it's all becoming quite clear now to a lot of people, more than the sort of select little group of conspiracy theorists. And when the veil falls, when we have this kind of apocalypse, I think it's going to bring about a renaissance of humanity, and that we'll be kinder and nicer to each other and look each other in the eye, and hanging out in person and singing and making art is going to be like a new, exciting, novel, fun thing to do that everyone wants to do. And everyone's like, oh my God, have you heard of making music properly? Or have you heard of drawing? It's great. So yeah, thank you very much, Brandon. Peter.
Yeah, this is completely tangential, but perhaps to Nick's point about the use of sound. I'll just give you a quick example. I joined in, I don't know quite how to describe it, an event with a singer, Tom Kenyon, who has this multi-octave voice. And during the course of this wonderful ethereal singing that he does on the stage, I saw quite distinctly the formation of half a dozen or so very tall columns of light. Okay. And after a while, they kind of drifted off the apron and up through the audience and disappeared. So this bizarre event. But at the end of this seance, was it? I don't know quite what. Somebody in the audience asked him, these Hathors that you're talking about, when they manifest, how do they look? And he said, well, they're tall columns of light, which is exactly what I saw over there. But the curious thing now is that nobody I was with saw them. Okay. And that led me to ask the question is, why should higher order or higher dimensional beings make their presence known to some and not to others? Okay, so there's a question there that we have to ask ourselves about our own orientation to reality. And so I'll leave it at that. But what I saw was clear and distinct and was verified by Tom Kenyon himself. And he has a consistent philosophy and account around these beings, which I'm not a party to. I mean, I haven't followed it up. But I always found it curious that they should have made themselves visible to myself and not to others. And I think there's something in there that we need to get to the bottom to. And perhaps next week when we talk about entities, perhaps that'll be part of that conversation.
Great. Thank you, Peter.
You're welcome.
So we're getting to have, spent 2 hours on the call now. So does anyone have any little wrapping up thoughts they'd like to share? Miles?
I wanted to just, is it JD? Does cosmology and astrology?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know much about astrology other than from the Yuga system point of view. According to Bibhu Desh Mishra, we're coming out of Kali Yuga, whether you use the Yoga Nanda and Sri Yukteswar model, maybe it happened a little earlier, and then if you're using sidereal, we're coming out of Piscean and heading into Aquarian. So let's just say at least two models, cosmological models, are suggesting that we're in a death rebirth phase. So let's imagine that as above, so below, or archetypally inside each human consciousness or psyche, there is this push towards death and rebirth, whether we're conscious of it or not. And so everybody on the line has their own practice and in their own way is working with that archetype. I mean, working consciously with trying to voluntarily surrender something and break through into a more expansive or more compassionate or higher order. We use the word order and chaos. We've used compassion and retraction, whatever the dichotomy might be. But it seems to me that broadly speaking, most of the planet is still very much asleep. And so then the impulse that is being activated because of the cosmological sea change may cause people to have a death wish in the most rudimentary way, just the most coarse way, most dense way. I'm thinking you use the word apocalypsis, and Epstein files is a kind of apocalypsis, like just how rampant some of the most primitive, evil, sadistic, and how rife and widespread this kind of death wish and this sort of instinctual, death wish is. So and I can't remember who it was. It might have been Nick, who was just very much just put it out there. It seemed at the time as kind of left field, like making an actual sacrifice. Maybe that's what's happening, is that there is an actual sacrifice happening in the world, but it's just so unconscious. And so there were a couple of examples of this, and one of them was in Iran with the sort of martyrdom as one example. The sacrifice of actual children in these sort of Epstein cults sort of is another. The more widespread one of sacrificing our kids' attention to the devices is another. And this is in stark contrast to all these mystical traditions that are suggesting how to work with that impulse in a more symbolic way. So you have this juxtaposition between a symbolic processing, surrender, sacrifice, a voluntary death. You have all that impulse versus the one that is happening or being born out in the most unconscious and destructive way. So I wanted to just throw that out there to see if people have any thoughts about that, to kind of conclude or to wrap up.
Thank you, Miles. Anyone want to say anything to that?
I was just I will try to keep it brief. I think that in a lot of different ways of timing things, and we don't necessarily require them to know that this is odd times, and something is very intense about what's going on right now. And it's weird, it's interesting because a lot of times within the ways that could be interpreted within spiritual traditions that pay attention to time is that it also is ripe for particular kinds of progress to occur. So it's like the darkest, weirdest moment is also the moment where, and some use this as a justification for why tantric practice is so powerful now, because this is the time where transformation of our attachments or the way that we engage with the material world, having strayed so far from its importance, like a holy material, if you will, like rediscovering these things now will have like the broadest and most powerful impact. And I think it's interesting because we circled around lots of different ideas, some which are why sacrifice would maybe be something that we're considering within our various works that we are doing. So like there was a lot of attention, like Peter Gray gave the example of how aware he was whenever he was offering the wild violet and the various ongoings that it's kind of wrapped up inside of. So I think for me, at least, like if there's a practice in which we're engaged in, it's why I would say it may seem like a cop-out, but it's like if we are engaged in either overt or subtle or symbolic or literal sacrifice, that there's something that is pushing us towards right relation. So whatever that might mean for us, how we frame that in orders or chaos and or higher realms, lower realms, whatever, I think it's about putting things better into right relation. And it seemed like the other one is something I've had a conversation with some people here about, is the way that our eros is really hijacked by a lot of the things that draw our attention these moments, So be that like the media cycle or our engagement with dating apps or whatever it might be, gaming on your phone or whatever it could be. I do think this is a level to which we are being kind of forced into some areas where we're sacrificing our eros over to something else, where it would be much better to put it in a place that I think cultivates right relation, like creative capacity, and bringing forward something that is generative and reminds us of how we're, what is possible, rather than being caught in all of that. So yeah, it was an interesting conversation. It was lovely to hear everybody's thoughts and see where it all went.
Thank you so much, JD. Yeah, I think as well about this idea of unintentionally giving your attention to something and consciously creating is very different. It does feel a bit like we're in a death cult right now. And Shaween mentioned this idea of martyrdom, and this, I talked recently about, Steiner's idea of Ahriman rising up against Lucifer, and there are these two extremes, and the third way is the consciousness of Christ, and there should be some other third way found, because it seems like amongst those who are happy to be martyred, who are so invested in this idea of spirit, and the afterlife is so appealing, and then on the other side you've got tech bros who are utterly terrified of dying and are trying to live forever and are injecting fecal matter, and every single moment of their day is spent in some breathing tube or taking 1,000 supplements every morning. Like the terror of death and the complete desire to die seem to be like battling it out right now.
I have a funny thing to say to that. My funny thing to say to that is, actually I have vitiligo. And I actually I did gut floral transplant. Interesting enough, Brian Johnson is crazy, so I completely agree with you, Sarah. But I will say the fecal matter transplant does work. My hair almost completely Gandalfed within a 3-month period, and it did help with that. However, that is something that is going on where they are trying to stop themselves from dying. And I think it is because of this level of being afraid of karma. And as Joseph Campbell states, they're also, they've mistaken the symbol for the literal representation of what the symbol represents. And so this level of immortality has been this kind of Faustian bargain that we have, as a collective, have mistaken the menu for the meal. Or the map for the territory. This, Alfred Korzinski's general semantics is really important. And I feel like if these types of ideals were understood in the collective zeitgeist a lot better, which is something I'm trying to do with my channel, is trying to get people to understand different levels of abstraction from the concrete experience all the way up into things like Orwellian War is Peace, is that we could really have a lot less argumentation and really move ourselves to this higher level of like a transcendent experience and magic being everywhere all at once. And I will state also how that idea of taking control of your intentional awareness, I think, is why we are all trying to have people understand that magic and the embodied practice are what help fine-tune the nervous system so we can tap into the parasympathetic from the sympathetic nervous system and calm the limbic structures, which is kind of what Nick was saying with the herbs, talking about sound and all these things, is that like when the more I meditate, the more I do Kung Fu, and the more I read classical literature and have my own ritual practice and am intentional with my girlfriend, and all of a sudden everything I'm, as we all are trying to be creators and trying to get our stuff out there, it's like I have to have the little black box. We have to have these discussions. The globalized world isn't going away. But when we do the silence and we finally adapt ourselves to the great mysteries, we then can have the intentional awareness of using these things with conscious agency instead of being the NPCs or the robots or just the slaves that are the master slave dichotomy that Nietzsche talks about. We can then become our own Ubermenches, which is then why that embodied practice is so important, because things like an autoimmune disease are also the symptoms of everything we're talking about here. Me sacrificing my lower, my higher desires for my lower ones, where all of a sudden I just ate too much sugar as my youth, and all of a sudden stressful moments happen, and all of a sudden epigenetics kicks in, and then we have these things that we can't figure out why they're happening. Why is my immune system attacking itself? Well, as we see in the Republic, as above, so below, as within, so without, as so the state goes, so does the individual. Well, if the individual continues to be sick, so will the state. And if the state continues to be sick, so will the individual. So it always go back to everything. And I'm saying, whatever Kung Fu is for you guys, I keep telling everybody in my audience and every moment I can get, it's do magic and train Kung Fu. So,
yeah, I think one of the most powerful magics is tidying your room. It's that act of order. And I feel like, if there's something wrong, if there's something I want to happen, I tidy my room. That's my magic. Siri.
Yeah, I think actually this has a lot to do with our perception of time. This dichotomy between the Luciferian and the Ahriman, right? It's an attachment to a future that hasn't happened, or it's an attachment to a past that you're trying to cling on to. So if we start to mend this, our perception of linear time, this idea of there being a back and a forth, and come back to presence, I think that's really what it is. We are sacrificing presence for appearance all the time. That's what's happening. And if we instead try to start sacrificing the appearance of things for real presence, and come into real experience, like so many people have talked about the notion of embodiment, of presence, through ritual, through meditation. So many of the keys to how this is going to happen for humanity, I think, is through the wisdom and the lineages that have been preserved only in esoteric practices, right? Only on the fringes, really, of things, because it's the rejected knowledge, it's the rejected traditions that are actually going to help us come back to that presence, and that they've been the wisdom keepers of what we need now in order to kind of revivify society. So yeah, I think that's kind of the central pillar, presence. Yeah.
I love the word revivify. I'm glad to end our session with that word. So I hope that you all have very sweet dreams this evening. And thank you so much for coming along. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. I thought it was great. And I'm so glad that you were all able to take part. And see you next week for entities. And then after entities, we're going to do psyops. Me and Pascal have been plotting some psyops chats. So thank you so much, everyone, and hopefully see you again next time.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everybody. It was lovely.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.